we want to stop wasting precious time. By using a framework that allows us to have focus and discipline and get everyone to have a shared understanding, we can come up and not be distracted by all the things that are competing for our attention and build solutions that people will absolutely love. That is the solution design framework.
I had a question on shadowing. I know that's a good technique. So are there practical ways to get access to customers so they feel comfortable with you following them around?
It depends on how often you are communicating with your customers. I think that's really important, and sort of just the general sentiment towards your product. If you have customers that are really in love with your product, they might just be like really eager to help out. There have been times where clients have come to us and they want us to recruit some customers, and after getting a sense of their affinity to the brand or the company, we said, hey, let's try this actually without an incentive. I think they'll just be really eager to help out based on all the activity that's going on in social media. Whereas some actually may be actually much harder, and you need to really figure out a way to get through to those folks. I have found it particularly hard with, say, business executives and stuff like that to be able to shadow those folks, but eventually you can get through with the right techniques.
Okay.
So you gave some good examples for prototyping. I was wondering if you had any examples or suggestions, any recommended software for like the eye tracking or heat mapping?
I think, so eye tracking, I think that's something where you're going to end up needing equipment for that and go into a formal lab. But for heat maps, I think it's Crazy Egg has heat maps as well as ClickTail. And those are clickable heat maps. So it's not like, like an eye tracking software will generate the heat map based on where they're looking. It's only on what they're interacting with. But those are actually two relatively inexpensive tools that will generate those reports for you. Yeah.
What best practice do you recommend when you design the tool to embed certain ways to capture this information as users use this in real life?
How does analytics tie in with the design process essentially, and are you
and
making that in
the product?
Yeah. This is actually kind of a tricky one. I try to, so at the beginning stage of whenever I'm helping somebody out with design, I try to figure out what the goals are and what sort of success criteria we have, but ultimately just following what sort of metrics can we infer, or what sort of correlations can we make as we go through this design process, and start talking to the development team to see if we can start baking those in once we start talking about the wireframe stage. Because from there, the wireframes will give us enough information to demonstrate the functionality. And so that is ultimately, like, if it's something where the developers can do that, or if, say, we're allowed to get access to the system and, say, implement something like Mixpanel, where we can design the data capture mechanisms ourselves, then that's one way we can do it too.
Do you know of any good resources for product managers that they could actually understand the basic concepts, kind of like a UI 101 for product managers, as well as just keeping up with what's new in the field? So you don't always hear it in a meeting, but you know a little about it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I know of some books that are really good, but in terms of an online resource that's really helping people get started. So from a book perspective, I would definitely recommend Don't Make Me Think from Steve Krug. Steve Krug's local here, by the way. He actually gives workshops all the time. If you ever have an opportunity to go to one of those, highly recommend it. You think of Zipcar as a well-designed interface or whatnot, but he always tests Zipcar with some participant just to demonstrate usability testing, and they stumble every time. I have not seen somebody use Zipcar successfully from his tests. It's really crazy. He also had a follow-up book called Rocket Surgery Made Easy, which isn't talking about basic usability principles and user experience design, but Rocket Surgery Made Easy was actually a guide book for having people conduct their own testing. without going to an outside shop to do that. I highly recommend that one as well because it's something we can all do. We all have the ability to call up customers and go into their office and talk to them. Actually, 7 years ago, I did my own usability test, and I just went to, it was actually a bunch of executives that I had to recruit, and I went to their office, did probably about a 30 to 45 minute usability session. I got, the results I got were so much better because they were so candid versus the lab testing that I did several years before that. So anybody can do this. You don't have to rely on a professional. Now, I will say that how quickly you can go through these, and watch out for certain sort of things and personalities. Like sometimes you have quiet people. Are you really good at getting them to talk? Or you have people that just can't shut up, and you're just like, okay, I want you to get focused on the task. You'll deal with that. But I mean, I'd rather you folks try this on your own because it really allows you to get in front of that customer and start to understand that pain that they go through. We actually did an ebook on 50 best practices in UX, so that could also serve as a potential resource for you. It goes through a section, a chapter on UI design, so there's like 10 different best practices on UI design. There's one on code, like for mobile as well as web. There's one on content strategy, and then also user research, best practices on like usability and field testing and stuff like that.
When you grow and you're looking for people, how do you find UX people?
Great question. So we get a bunch of inquiries coming in. People want to get into the field of UX design, and so a lot of times we get folks that are in the web design space and they want to understand how software works or how to handle the interaction design components, because sometimes they're not really used to that, especially when it comes to complex software or simple software that actually has a lot of complex underpinnings. So we end up we vet these candidates out through doing some video interviews. I think we were chatting about this earlier, but also having them do test scenarios to figure out who's actually a good fit. Now, in terms of finding these folks, some of the times we don't use job boards as much, but they're say Treehouse or some alumni boards like RISD have been okay. But ultimately, it's come from going to certain design conferences, like Event Apart. They came here in Boston, and we got a lot of great connections at that conference. There's also some career fairs that sort of pop up every now and then that are design-oriented. But those have just been, that and general word of mouth have been allowed us to sort of find candidates, recruit them, and
Educational background for UX people. I mean, if one wanted to go to school for it today, would they be going to an engineering school? Would they be going to RISD? Where would you find courses?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I find that the field that is closely related to UX design, or one that just can easily adapt, is industrial design. So going to a RISD career fair, I saw a lot of bright kids that were out in the field testing their ideas, coming up with prototypes, and even getting involved in the web a little bit. And so it just seemed like a real natural progression for the industrial design students. I think folks that are in sort of the web or mobile design space can also be potential candidates, but it's just a little bit tricky because ultimately what we're talking about is solving problems creatively. And some folks, I've run into a lot of designers that are really into making something that responds emotionally. They're like, I love this design. They get attached to it, but is it really solving the problem? And that is something that we particularly look for when we're just taking a look at designers that are trying to get into the space. In rare cases, you may find somebody that was in comp sci and then decided to go into the design world, and so they have been playing in both worlds, and that's really great. So there are a lot of different, there's no UX design school out there at the moment. Well, Bentley does have a good program, but I think it's pretty new, and so it's not like they're keeping up with the demand for what businesses need in terms of hiring. So it's going to be a while before we see an influx of all UX designers. Most of them have to just kind of get immersed and learn pretty quickly.
what websites or books do you suggest as far as inspiration? Or something that you enjoy?
So there are a couple. There's Dan O'Reilly, A-R-I-E-L-Y. He created a book called Predictably Irrational. And he gave a great TED Talk. I mean, you probably want to see the TED Talk and you'll be motivated by the book. But talking about how we make decisions irrationally, and a lot of it ties with user experience terms, sort of invalidates some things that we think are what people want or think of what is intuitive. And he sort of challenged this notion by doing these various experiments that show that sometimes we make decisions that just don't make sense at all. One that I liked was Made to Stick by Dan and Chip Heath, I believe it was. Yeah, that was read that a while ago, and I thought that was pretty inspirational in terms of the psychology behind, what do people gravitate towards, and how do you really appeal to their senses? Because that's part of it too. Sometimes it's not just about how user-friendly something is or how efficient it is. There is an emotional component to it, and understanding the psychology behind that is pretty key.